Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's discussion entitled U.S. Foreign Policy Towards the Middle East in 2022. I'm Dale Sprusansky, the managing editor of the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, and I'm very honored to be moderating today's discussion. Today's event takes place as part of a broader series of events held by InterRegional for Strategic Analysis, projecting what to expect around the world this year. The center has already held events in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and today they are turning their focus closer to home to assess the Middle East. Specifically today, we will be discussing what people can expect in the region in 2022 as it pertains to US policy, especially given heightened tensions with Russia and China, and of course, the seemingly never-ending drama surrounding Iran. We have four great speakers today in a confined amount of time. Each speaker will have 20 minutes to offer their thoughts on their assigned topics. After that, we're going to transition to a Q&A session. I have been asked to keep each speaker's bio brief, as distinguished as they are, so that we can have as much time as possible for discussion. So we will begin today with Dr. John Calabrese, who teaches international relations at American University in Washington, D.C. He also serves as a scholar at the Middle East Institute and as director of the Institute's Middle East Asia Project. He's also the book review editor of the Middle East Journal, which is published by the Middle East Institute. His topic today is situating the Middle East in U.S. foreign policy. And with that, the floor is yours, Dr. Calabrese.
Thanks, Dale. And thanks to Mona Ali and thanks for InterRegional for Strategic Analysis for giving me the honor and the privilege of participating along with my distinguished colleagues in this session. So I'm going to be the stage setter. I want to paint a kind of a landscape of what I see the region looks like from Washington as an entry point for the subsequent speakers to sort of drill down into more specific areas that may be of concern. And I want to do that basically by doing three things. First, to kind of give a snapshot of the circumstances that the Biden administration inherited and has been operating in since entering office. Second, to discuss some of the key considerations and choices that the administration has made with respect to the region and the kind of principles or priorities guiding both their perspectives and their choices. And third, maybe just briefly to offer some thumbnail sketches of the state of play of U.S. relations with a few of the regional actors. So first, to the circumstances as I see them. And at the international level, I think we see telltale signs of both climate change advancing, growing support for efforts toward decarbonizing economies, major power strategic competition, particularly with China, but as we see on the fringe of the Europe-Russia landscape, strategic competition intensifying. At the regional level, I think the conditions and the uncertainties really do create very challenging circumstances and have for the administration as they remain volatile in so many ways. Syria still more or less in conflict, Lebanon in free fall, Tunisia going through sort of turmoil politically, Iraq still struggling with trying to appoint a president. At the same time, though, there are encouraging signs of a kind of a shift toward diplomacy first, de-escalation and dialogue kind of pattern. You could see that with the rapprochement between Qatar and the Saudis and the others. You could see that with the outreach to Iraq. You could see that with the sort of softening of relations, or at least the willingness to consider de-escalating tensions, Turkey with UAE, Turkey with Egypt, all of those things encouraging, but not, I think, sufficient to offset the kind of volatility and concerns that things could actually reverse course quite easily. At the domestic level, the Biden administration is really struggling, I think, to overcome two major dual challenges. The first, of course, is the pandemic, and the second related to that are the adverse economic consequences associated with the pandemic. They're also dealing with those things against the backdrop of a deeply polarized electorate, hyper-partisanship in the Congress, tensions within the president's own party, and the narrowest of margins in the Congress. So taking those three levels of analysis and just the snapshot that I offered, how then would I characterize or what observations maybe could I offer about how they implicate US policy toward the Middle East? My first observation would be that the United States in the long term will continue to be less dependent on the region's energy resources. But in the short term and in the medium term, I believe that there's ample evidence to suggest that the US will remain as sort of tied to the Middle East's energy resources, if not more so, in the short term and in the medium term. And here are the reasons why. I mean, number one, we see right before us the predicament that Europe faces due to its over-reliance on Russian oil and gas. And I think to the extent that the United States can assist Europe in diversifying its sources away from Russia and toward the Gulf, I think that will be critically important to the United States and the transatlantic alliance. Second, because I believe that the Biden administration's domestic climate change-related energy policies in some ways I think are going to make it more difficult for the United States to sort of decouple from the Middle East's energy resources. Curbing fossil fuels while at the same time, needing infusion of oil and gas because of steady and increasing demand is still going to make the Middle East sort of matter to the United States, at least in the short term. To me, though, the third point, I think, is the more interesting one and compelling one. And that is that, oil is a global commodity. And as far as I can tell, it's an indispensable bridge fuel on the road to eventual decarbonization. But decarbonization is not going to happen in one decade or in several. And therefore, the Middle East's oil will remain essential to the global economy and indirectly, therefore, of vital importance to the United States. My second observation is that I think for the third time in 3/4 of a century, the US policy community is about to enter, if it hasn't already entered, into a sort of a period in which regional developments are interpreted, if not exclusively, then at least partially through a global strategic lens. 1.0 was the Cold War, when the United States tended to view developments in Cold War terms. 2.0 was when the United States tended to view regional development through war on terrorism terms. And I think what we might be poised to see US policymakers do as we enter period 3.0 is to look at the Middle East increasingly through the prism of great power rivalry, and particularly China's growing and extensive relations with the Middle East and with the Gulf countries in particular, and how that might implicate United States interests. My third observation would be that the administration is not completely hamstrung, but there's no doubt that it's caught in a number of different cross-cutting pressures and constraints, both within the Congress and because of some of the domestic problems and challenges that I mentioned earlier. And therefore, I think that we've seen it already, and we will continue to see that it's going to be difficult for the administration, on the one hand, to craft Middle East policy, but to conduct a policy under those constraints. I think you're going to see a lot of sort of a push or even a backlash when it comes to human rights issues, when it comes to arms sales to the region, and when it comes to relieving sanctions against Iran, whether or not there's the expectation or the hope that the JCPOA may be revived is realized. But for all I've said about circumstances conditioning U.S. foreign policy in the region, I think we also have to understand and that the administration, every administration's sort of perspectives and choices, matter as much or perhaps even more than the circumstances that they face. And so, at least from the US perspective, the way I understand our government to operate, the president and the office of the presidency are the stewards of American foreign policy. They set the course. President Biden, unlike his two immediate predecessors, is a known commodity when it comes to foreign policy. You may like it, you may dislike it, you may be skeptical, but there are at least three things we know about the president, I think, that undergird his approach to foreign policy as in global terms and by extension as it relates to the Middle East. The first is that he's a committed internationalist. The second is that he's a staunch multilateralist. And the third is that he has an unyielding belief, whether you think he's naive or somehow senile or not, an unyielding belief that the United States can and that the United States must continue to play a leading role in global affairs. And I would underscore this, that whatever the challenges the United States faces, including, and I think he's acknowledged this, that the United States has entered a period in which it is sort of relatively speaking in decline, the United States is anything but incapacitated. And so what I would take away from this is that this administration is not neo-isolationist. This administration is not a go-it-alone administration. And this president is not a mercurial or unpredictable president. On the other hand, neither is this president and his administration a transformational one. This administration seems to me to be determined to avoid setting maximalist goals that they perceive to be unachievable. I think that they've emphasized in their remarks and to a large extent in their behavior that their worst fear is overcommitting and overpromising. And I think that, we've seen how this has played out in the Middle East, and I'll get to that in a moment. But a few days ago, I read an essay by the Georgetown professor Daniel Brunberg that I commend to you. It was published on an online publication called Responsible Statecraft. And he said something that really caught my attention. He said, the Biden administration's approach to foreign policy is not a grand strategy. Don't expect to see, and we haven't seen it already, sort of be tagged with the term that we're accustomed to seeing with his predecessors. There is no Biden doctrine. If anything, there's a Biden non-doctrine. I would add to that, the absence of an overarching grand strategy, it may not be an accident. It may not be an oversight, and it may not necessarily be a failing. It's a choice. And so then what are the choices as they relate to the Middle East that we can discern from the events of the last year? Number one is, I think that the Biden administration has made it quite clear that they are intent on distinguishing to the extent possible between what they refer to as vital interests and discretionary interests. And there, they've highlighted three such interests. One, ensuring the safe passage of oil. Two, preventing a hostile local or external regional power from achieving hegemony. And third, protecting the US homeland. I think that they seem to have indicated, at least from my observation, that they will focus their attention primarily on the Gulf and to a lesser extent on the Arab-Israeli conflict or issues and challenges and opportunities specifically related to the Maghreb. I think that they've also outlined what I see to be, their number one and number two, and then I would say, a number three, but vague priority. Their number one priority, as far as I can tell, is addressing the Iranian nuclear issue. Their number two priority is keeping the waterways safe, and so maritime security, I think, is right up there. The number three priority is something that they've articulated, but I don't think that they've explained it at least in a way that I understand. And they've said that, they want to contribute to regional stability. Okay, but how do they want to do that? What are they prepared to fight for? What price are they prepared to pay? What risks and costs are they willing to incur? I think that, leaving this vague, even if it's deliberate, purposeful, on the one hand, I could see that there might be some purposefulness to it, in the sense that they leave it to our regional partners and allies to sort of pick up the ball and come together, or at least try to come together to try to sort of shape events in the region themselves. Although we saw that when the United States sort of relinquished its role to the degree that the Trump administration did, that some of the consequences of relinquishing the role that the United States had played, I think, were very counterproductive, both to regional actors, the region as a whole, and United States interests. The final thing I'd say here is that I see three themes emerging from US behavior over the past year. One is this kind of focus on maintaining deterrence capability. Two is an emphasis on quietly, and I'd underscore the word quietly, urging and fostering de-escalation and dialogue amongst regional countries and partners. And third, it's not clear to me that the United States is steering this effort as much as the United States is, I think, quietly welcoming, and I think you might see maybe more overt efforts to nurture a regional power balance that offsets what I believe to be, is Iran's current and future sort of strategic advantages in the region as a whole. Whether the JCPOA is revived or not. Now, quickly to just a few snapshots on a couple of relationships. One of those relationships is the relationship with Saudi Arabia, which, as I'm sure you're very familiar with the fact that both during the 2020 presidential campaign and in the opening weeks and months of the Biden administration upon taking office, I would characterize the U.S.-Saudi relationship as bumpy at best. But many others would say that it really had hit rock bottom. Now, and they've given various sort of like data points to indicate what it was that U.S. policymakers and the president himself had said. That Saudi Arabia is a pariah state, that I have no interest in meeting with MBS, and all of this. As I've watched this kind of relationship unfold, I'm not sure that we're back to business as usual. But I have seen that the adjustments in the U.S.-Saudi relationship from the U.S. point of view are not as dramatic and not as pronounced as may have been promised or many had expected would occur. I think that there is a distancing between the president and the crown prince, but I think, for all intents and purposes, that, that there's a lot less daylight between the two governments than I think many would believe. Certainly, there's no fundamental rupture in the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. National Security Director for the Middle East, Brett McGurk, he just recently mentioned, and maybe we shouldn't take him at his word, but he characterized the relationship as a historic partnership that will endure. He went on to say that the defense of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was fundamental interest of the United States. And, I read the readout of President Biden's phone call with King Salman just a few days ago. And, it was very heavy on sort of the security dimension of the relationship and very light on anything else. So there really doesn't seem to be like any fundamental break between, the relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia in this administration and the US-Saudi relationship in the previous administration, in spite of the atmospherics and the language. And when we could discuss, A, whether or not you think that's true, and B, if you more or less agreement with me, then, what are the factors that may be informing what some people would say is a kind of a backtracking on the part of the Biden administration. The second relationship I think that's really interesting is second event is the designation of Qatar as a major non-NATO ally. The third such designation after Kuwait and Bahrain, following the recent meeting between President Biden and Sheikh Tamim. And so, how do I interpret this? Number one, I see it in a way as fortuitous, because you could argue that had it not been for the paving of the way for this kind of elevation of Qatar's status that was provided by the rapprochement between the Saudis and the Emiratis on the one hand and Qatar on the other, it may not have occurred, or it may not have occurred as early as it did, and maybe, or if so, maybe with less sort of celebratory publicity attached to it. But I do see, some of the reasons behind it. One, the role that Qatar played in the evacuation of refugees from and allies from Afghanistan. To the channel that Qatar played and continues to play, and the fact that it represents the United States in Kabul. The third, and here I think this is very interesting. I mean, given Qatar's role in the global LNG market and the kind of constraints that our European allies are under, it just seems to me that the timing is just like too coincidental. And that my guess would be, or if I were a US policymaker, I would be doing all I could to encourage, cajole, pressure the Qataris to do what they could to try to assist and support the Europeans in diversifying their sources of natural gas, if not like in the immediate term, then as quickly as possible, helping to give them options. I also saw that one of the crowning achievements of the meeting was a $20 billion Boeing contract that Qatar signed. And so you see, feeding into this relationship, I think a variety of sort of considerations on the part of the Biden administration. First and foremost, the security dimension. But, these other sort of, I wouldn't call them ancillary interests, but, very important interests given the position that the Biden administration is in domestically. The third relationship that I'll just mention very briefly is the one with the UAE, which I found very fascinating for a couple of reasons. One, I see a lot of pundits talking about, the souring of Emirati-US relations, placing a lot of stock into what has happened or hasn't happened with the F-35 deal, focusing very intently on the intelligence community's sort of report or allegations of the construction of something like a Chinese military facility inside the Khalifa port in UAE, warning signs that maybe the relationship was somehow deteriorating. I really don't see it that way at all. I see only one telephone number in Abu Dhabi, and that telephone number, when UAE is under threat, is the United States. And I think that the relationship between the United States and the UAE is still sort of its foundational aspect is the security partnership. I don't think that the UAE is trying to wriggle out of it. And I don't think that the United States in any way is either determined or tempted to abandon it. And so I would characterize, in fact, what's happening before us just in the last couple of weeks with the Houthi, drone strikes and missile strikes and the US response as being, emblematic, illustrative of both the need on the part of UAE for the United States security umbrella to sort of be sustained, and the United States' sort of willingness and capability to sustain it. We could talk about other things.
Step in here to let you know your time is about up here. I've been asked to make sure you wrap it up.
Cool.
I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect. I'm just going to make three quick comments. One is that, and I hope we'll discuss this in Q&A. I'm sure this is going to come up in my colleagues' presentations. From my vantage point in Washington, Iran is going to pose the #1 challenge to the United States in the region. I think irrespective of what happens with the JCPOA negotiations. I think that's the case because of the absence of a security architecture in the region, I think that's because, whatever traction there is in these talks and dialogues between the Saudis and the Iranians, that can diffuse tension, but that can't really resolve like fundamental policy differences. And I would also say that Iran's not going to go away. Iran is like a permanent feature of the strategic landscape in the Gulf, an important player, I would say in many ways possesses the characteristics to be a dominant player in the Gulf. And that's something that the rest of the region is going to have to contend with, and the US is going to have to contend with going forward. The second thing I would say is that major power rivalry will continue to inform United States foreign policy. On the one hand, that's a good thing, because that will incentivize the United States to remain deeply and extensively engaged in the region. On the other hand, it could strain US relations with its regional partners. And it could also, I guess, on the other hand, provide leverage to those partners to play the United States and China off against each other. The final thing, and the last final thing that I would say, is I think you can count on the United States still striving and struggling to sort of limit the extent of its commitments to the region, and to be more reactive than proactive, and to seek to burden share in terms of its deterrent capabilities when it even comes to the Gulf, and to extend and to depend on its allies to extend its own diplomatic reach in the region. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. That was a really great overview of what we're doing here today. And it's just a very interesting way to set the stage with this idea of a great power competition being the focus of US foreign policy, but also the lack of a US grand strategy, and yet kind of things progress on a day-to-day basis. So with that, we're going to move over to David Des Roches, who is the assistant professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. He will be discussing, he's an expert there on GCC regional security, border security, weapons transfers, missile defense, counterinsurgency, terrorism, and emerging trends. And today he will be discussing a topic that I know is at the forefront of many people in the Gulf, which is the changing US approach to the region, which many people have described as a withdrawal by the US. And with that, David Des Roches, the platform is yours.
Oh, thank you, Dale. It's a real honor. It's an honor to be here. And again, I just am thrilled to be in the company of such scholars. I want to thank the InterRegional group for having me. I have to say at the outset that my views are not those of the US government. I'm not really in the government anymore, but I worked with Matthew Kroenig, who you'll hear from later, and you'll understand why he went onward to greater things. He was too good for government. The topic of is the US leaving the Middle East is an evergreen. And I've got to tell you, ever since the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review, which announced the pivot, people in the Middle East have said the Americans are leaving us. And I got to say, I've made quite a nice little side hustle discussing this. It's just not the case. In some instances, I've given the same talk in successive years to the same audience. And both times I'm like, wow, I don't believe it, because there just seems to be this vestigial feeling, it's not cerebral. Cerebrally, you can convince people that it's not happening, but there's this vestigial idea that the United States is leaving the region. And as Professor Calabrese noted, in the end, the United States remains the indispensable security power. So let's talk about this, and hopefully I'll be brief and save more time for questions. The perception, this is in the context of the 2015 JCPOA, but it dates from the pivot and arguably goes back even earlier, is that the United States was eager to cut a deal and leave for various nefarious purposes. Didn't like it, wanted to empower Israel, wanted to, extracted all the mineral resources, viewed that the real economic goal was in Asia, whatever it is. That is a persistent thing. And almost every security decision made that has an impact in the Middle East is usually interpreted in the region through that lens. There's a lot of, as with any theory, you can gather evidence to prove it's there. But I would argue that the American commitment is usually measured by a bad measurement, which is number of soldiers who sleep for one night in the country or the number of ships sailing in and out of the region. I think that's a little bit misleading because, you know, the United States is a global power. We're the only power in history whose primary security objectives lie in another hemisphere and has the ability to actually reinforce in another hemisphere quickly. So first off, when did we really start in the Middle East? Well, the answer is in the Carter administration. This is his State of the Union address, where he enunciated what was known as the Carter Doctrine. Prior to that, the US presence in the Middle East was very, very small. There had been a few Strategic Air Command bomber bases, one in Peshawar in Pakistan, one in Dhahran, that were phased out as superfluous. There have always been small military training missions, places like Iran, Saudi Arabia, fewer than 5,000 soldiers. And of course, a training mission is not capable of fighting. It's senior officers, advisors, and instructors. In many instances, they don't even have weapons. And there was a small naval presence, but a very small naval presence. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the Iranian Revolution led to the enunciation of the Carter Doctrine. And it's not generally understood. Over the years, it's been interpreted as absolute support for each individual regime in the Gulf. I've highlighted what I think are the key words. President Carter said we would use any means necessary, including military force. That's what folks in the Gulf hear and basically have come to rely on. But the other key qualifiers are that it has to be an outside force, and it has to be an attempt to gain control of the region. So theoretically, you know, a revolution or you know, a protest movement or a small country, you know, no longer under the control of that, theoretically, that wouldn't necessitate an American involvement in that. The misinterpretation of this was very prominent in the Arab Spring when you had protests in some countries, most notably Bahrain, and it became obvious the United States said, oh no, the Carter Doctrine is not about protecting the regime, it's about protecting the country. And this is an internal matter that, you know, quite frankly, we're not going to get involved in. Now, even when the Carter Doctrine was enunciated, the U.S. troop presence did not, we weren't there in any substantial presence until the oil tanker war started, when we started with naval presences. But again, there was no ground presence, no air presence. What changed that was Operation Desert Storm. And then in the wake of Desert Storm, you had the Southern Watch operation, the perennial air policing to keep Saddam Hussein's Air Force grounded. You also had the beginning of a persistent presence in Kuwait that surged with the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, but it went down again. But I just want to point out that globally, not just in the Middle East, the trend is for American forces to not be stationed overseas. And there's a number of reasons for that. We have rapid lift. We have, you know, an unrivaled airlift capability. When the evacuation from Kabul was going off the skids, we were able to move 2,500 troops from Fort Bragg, North Carolina to Kuwait to stage forward, and that was done within 24 hours. No other country in the world has that capacity. So it is in the context of a global reduction of troops overseas. The problem is if you just live in the Middle East and you're concerned about Middle East security, the fact that the overall trend is downward, that is of little of no interest to you. This gives a better idea of how U.S. troops deployments have gone. This is from 1950, and you can see, of course, you have deployments to Asia for the wars in Korea and Vietnam that rapidly declined. The deployment to Europe for the Cold War, which is also rapidly declined. And I would argue that this is much more significant than the presence in the Middle East, because in the Cold War, the European deployments, you know, people lived there with their families. That became a way of life. You have American schools, you know, social clubs, things like that. In the Middle East, you don't have that infrastructure except for the American high school in Bahrain. What you can see, though, is the Middle East presence. This is almost entirely in the Gulf. You have a brief spike for Desert Storm, and then it goes down until the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and it goes up. and then declines precipitously. But it's still far above where it was in 2000. So any reductions that we're seeing here, I would argue, represent more a reversion to norm rather than a decrease in US commitment to the region. Unfortunately, most people, it's a young region, and people who are ministers and in government probably aren't in the position they were in 2000. So they don't see this, they have come to see a large US presence in the region as normal, but I would argue that it is not. So I put it in global context, I put it in historical context. This is from 2020 and shows where troops are while the US still had a large force in place in Afghanistan. And what you can see is that you had 6,000 forces engaged in combat arms in Iraq. The number for Syria is hazed out because the Department of Defense has been kind of canny about those numbers, but I would argue 800 is probably the low end of the baseline, and I think it goes between 800 and 3,000. 3,000 in Saudi Arabia, all engaged in training operations. 5,000 in the UAE, mostly a small training mission, which is mostly US Marine Corps, but mostly an air presence based out of Al Dhafra. Qatar has 13,000. That's the air wing at Al Dhafra and also the two headquarters. Bahrain with the naval headquarters. And those, sometimes when you look at troop numbers in the Middle East, they surge rapidly. And that's because like if a carrier battle group goes into the region, those numbers are counted to Bahrain. So all of a sudden, if you look at the map by the numbers, Bahrain just had 54,000 sailors added, but those guys they aren't walking around Manama. And then a large presence in Kuwait, which that's done in the form of a garrison and also training units for rotation. So rotational presence. Now, here's where the argument gets a little complicated. This shows US forces in Afghanistan from 2002 to 2021. And of course, right now we're at 0. And what I argue is that a large number, and I've made this argument for 10 years, a large number of the forces in the Gulf are not there to defend the Gulf. They are in the Gulf to support US combat operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the reason why they're there, look at a map, look at where the US has bases. The Gulf is the closest place where you can have that level of support in an environment that is permissive for US forces and that doesn't cost us a lot of money. The Gulf is midway between the US installations in Europe, our defense base there, which has been put in place over 3 generations, and the theaters of combat operations. And our status of forces agreements, our defense cooperative agreements, are very, very favorable in the Gulf. In many instances, we get a lot of things. The Gulf states are good hosts. We get a lot of things there for free that we would have to pay for if we were operating in, say, Pakistan or the Central Asian republics of the former Soviet Union. So when you see this curve of US troops in Afghanistan, it is expected that you would see a similar surge and conversely a decline in US troop numbers in the Gulf. This shows the numbers of contractors and armed forces personnel in Afghanistan from 2015 until 2020. The armed forces is the red line, and that red line peters out when the Trump administration stopped providing troop numbers publicly. But you can kind of correlate. You can see that the number of contractors, which is in gray, roughly is in phase with the numbers of troops. You can extrapolate that numbers of troops. What I would argue is that the presence in the Gulf supporting these operations similarly should rise and fall along with that red line. And what we're seeing now is not a strategic withdrawal, retrenchment, renunciation of our security partners. It just reflects the fact that we had a very good deal in the Gulf and that a great part of our logistics structure was based there in the Gulf. Let me look now at Iraq and Syria. And again, same period, you can see that the numbers fall drastically, leading to the withdrawal. And then the exact troop numbers are not shown, but we're looking at a presence of less than 2,500. When you've got 160,000 people to support in Iraq, your support base is going to be much more significant than when you have 5,000 people to support. And so the absolute numbers there they're misleading. And I can, once again, on a regular basis, the same forum, the same people, I see the same arguments being made. I give the same speech and it comes as a revelation. I perhaps am giving out trade secrets here, but that's what we've got. Now, the numbers are small, but what's good news? The good news is twofold. First off, we now have, I spoke earlier of this lift, of this ability to reinforce. The United States has recognized that the best way to defend a place is not to have a soldier sitting on top of it, but to have the ability to rapidly come and go. And in order to do that more efficiently, it's more than just political commitment. It's more than having fast airlift ships or airlift planes and sea ships. You also have to have the infrastructure in place. Basically a series of, instead of a hot base occupied with troops on a continual basis, a warm base that has minimal infrastructure that can be rapidly expanded. Things like petroleum, hard pads that you can erect tents on, overnight, facilities for generator pits so that you have, or generator pads so that you have power for these facilities, an airfield, maybe a gymnasium, shower houses with water. This is what the United States increasingly has. So the photograph on the left shows the opening of the exchange, the place where you go to get snacks and clean socks, on Prince Sultan Air Base. Prince Sultan Air Base was the primary U.S. operating location in the Arabian Peninsula from the Saddam Hussein invasion until 2003, when the Saudis, who were facing domestic issues over the presence of American troops, asked us to leave. The CENTCOM forward headquarters used to be there. It relocated to Qatar. In 2019, after the Abqaiq attack, it was rapidly reestablished. And that reestablishment includes everything soldiers need to function, to include, as you see here, a post-exchange so that nobody runs out of Cheetos. The second, and this idea of small bases has been replicated in other countries, not quite as well as at PSAP, Prince Sultan Air Base, but it has been replicated in some other countries. The second thing is the upper corner, which shows, it really shows the Saudi rail network and the desired rail network. But I'm using it as a proxy to show what's called the Trans-Arabian Network, which is the plan for a logistic network that, logisticians looked at this and realized having all your ports in the Persian Gulf, which means they have to transit the Strait of Hormuz, within 100 miles of the Iranian shore to fight an Iranian enemy, is not the optimal logistical solution. And so planning has gone into establishing ports. There was a press announcement of port facilities being dedicated at Jeddah, from Jordan, along the Red Sea, and possibly from the Gulf of Aqaba via Jordan, and maybe even through other countries, who knows, inshallah. Again, the details of the facilities are not known to the general public, but I guess, speaking as the descendant of railwaymen, that the rails are a good indicator. And the picture on the lower right-hand corner is a Department of Defense release photograph that showed a logistical exercise where troops, U.S. vehicles were offloaded on the Red Sea coast of Saudi Arabia and then transported across the peninsula. It was both a logistic exercise and then a military exercise. So what we're left with, again, the number of troops based at specific countries in the Middle East has been hard to get a hold of since they stopped releasing official figures in 2017. But I've seen this, and this seems pretty much close to it. Close to what I know instinctively. Iraq, I think the number is a little high. I think that it's 2,500 in Iraq, and maybe those other 500 are conducting joint operations in Syria. Syria, 600 seems a little bit low. I think that you have to take Iraq and Syria together. Jordan seems about right. Egypt seems a bit low. Saudi Arabia, I think that number is right for permanent party. I mean, the people training the Saudi armed forces, plus an expeditionary capability located at PSAP, which is usually fighter aircraft, I think currently from the Marine Corps, as well as some Patriot and possibly THAAD air defense. Qatar seems about right. UAE seems about right. These numbers have increased recently with the notification that additional aircraft are deploying to the UAE. And the USS Cole, which some of us older folks will remember was bombed in Aden Harbor. It has been rehabilitated and will steam to, it's probably it's either there or it is within a day's sailing, and will be able to assume a missile defense role off the coast of Abu Dhabi. So what you have here is a framework to expand rapidly. And I know this goes against human nature. If an American soldier sleeps for more than 7 nights in a country, the citizens of that country tend to view the soldier as theirs. And when he leaves, they see it as an indication that the US commitment is decreasing. But my argument is that if you look at the overall context of US deployments overseas, the US strategic lift capability and US global strike capability, as well as the fact that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were the driver of a lot of that basing, not defending the Gulf, but the supporting the wars there, I think you'll see that the conclusion is a lot less scary than folks in the Gulf have. And I'll welcome your questions when we get to them.
All right, thank you so much. I think that's a very important perspective as we kind of tackle this idea of the US pulling out, that there's still a lot of troops and still even more capabilities in the region. Before we move on, I just want to point out 2 things for everyone. Just a reminder to our participants, you can always submit a question in advance so that we're ready to go when Q&A begins. And I've also been asked just to remind our speakers that today's event is being interpreted, so they appreciate everyone just kind of speaking in a way that makes the interpreter's job a little easier. So maybe a little slower is a little better. With that said, we'll move on to our 3rd speaker today, Dr. Matthew Kroenig, who is the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and the Director of the Center's Scowcroft Strategy Initiative. His research focuses on US national security policy, great power competition with China and Russia, and strategic deterrence and weapons non-proliferation. And today he will be sharing with us his thoughts on how the US is dealing with China's activities in the Middle East and what that means for the US. And with that, the platform is yours. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction, Dale. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. It's a pleasure to be speaking on these topics with some old colleagues like Professor Des Roches. We worked together on the Middle East office in DoD, and good to see some new colleagues as well. So I was asked to speak on China's activities in the Middle East and what this means for the US, and to make some predictions. And so my prediction is that that the rivalry between the United States and China will continue to intensify, and it will become increasingly difficult for countries around the world, including in the Middle East, to simultaneously maintain good relations with Washington and with Beijing. So that's my clear prediction, but I'll unpack that in a number of parts. First, I wanted to start by talking about US global China strategy. Second, I want to talk about debates in Washington about how that applies in the Middle East. Third, I would like to talk about some of the worrying trend lines in the Middle East from the point of view of US global China strategy. And then finally, I'll finish with some of these specific predictions that I led with. So I'm trying to speak deliberately, but please feel free to jump in and ask me to slow down if necessary for translation. So first, what is the global China strategy? And I think our first speaker, Professor Calabrese, was basically correct when he said there's not yet a Biden doctrine. But there have been several big themes. One has been this idea of democracy versus autocracy. You know, the United States and its democratic allies, especially in Europe and Asia, against revisionist autocracies like Russia and China. And so to deal with this, the United States needs to strengthen its alliances, strengthen its democracy at home. And so these have all been major themes of the Biden administration. And so as this applies globally and looking at different regions, I do think the Biden administration has tried to prioritize competition with China and a focus on Asia. And I think their strategy in the first year was to try to park the relationship with Russia with arms control agreements. Biden said he wanted a stable, predictable relationship with Russia. I think they wanted to park the Iran challenge in the Middle East by returning quickly to the Iran nuclear deal. And then I think they wanted to end these so-called forever wars by withdrawing from Afghanistan. And they thought by devoting less attention to Europe, the Middle East, and Afghanistan, that would free them up to focus on China. Now, I think we see that hasn't quite worked, they've been surprised by how difficult diplomacy has been with Iran. I think they've been surprised by how chaotic the withdrawal from Afghanistan proceeded. And I think they've been surprised by Russian aggression against Ukraine. But I think that was the hope, is to stabilize the Middle East and Europe, focus on China. And you did see several major initiatives to deal with China in the first year: the AUKUS agreement, the submarine deal between Britain, the United States, and Australia. Also the Quad arrangement, US, Japan, India, Australia, meeting at the head of state level for the first time. And so the China strategy, if you look at the interim national security strategy that the Biden administration released, there were 3 paragraphs. And I think these are essentially 3 pillars of the strategy. So first is strengthening ourselves to compete with China. You know, if you think about any competition, if you think about the Olympics, it's not so much about tearing down your opponent, but making yourself as fit as possible. Second is defending against the threats that China poses alongside ourselves and our allies. And I think the United States sees economic threats with China's unfair trade practices, political threats with China's genocide at home, international diplomacy threats with wolf warrior diplomacy, China's unhelpful activity in international organizations, and military threats, especially in Asia and Taiwan in particular. But then the third part of the strategy is to look for areas of cooperation where that makes sense: climate change, arms control, and some economic matters. So I think that's the global approach to China. How does this apply in the Middle East? Second major part of my talk. And I think there is a debate in Washington. And one view is that the China competition is primarily a competition in Asia, and that we need to focus our attention in Asia and focus in particular on defending Taiwan against a Chinese attack. So, for example, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy in the Trump administration, Elbridge Colby, strongly articulates this position, and he thinks that the United States should do less in Europe, should do less in the Middle East, that we really have to focus everything on China and defending Taiwan. I do think that's the minority view, however, and I think the majority view, and where the United States will eventually come out, is that the China challenge is a global challenge, not just a challenge in Asia. It's a global challenge. And so the United States needs to compete everywhere, including in the Middle East. This competition is not just a military competition. As I said, it is about economics and trade. It's about infrastructure. It's about values. And so given all of that, the Middle East is important because China has growing activities in all of these areas in the Middle East. And also China is very dependent on oil exports, I guess from China's point of view, imports from the Middle East. And so this is potentially a source of vulnerability for China. So China cares about the Middle East, and so it would be foolish for the United States to cede the region to China. So I do think that the majority view in Washington is that the Middle East is part of this global competition with China. So this then brings me to the third part of the talk, which is some of the worrying trends in the region from the point of view of great power competition. And I'm sure you know this, I'm sure you see this. China does have a growing presence and growing influence in the region. So 50% of China's oil imports come from the region. Saudi Arabia and Iran, two of the biggest, but there's others. China, last time I checked, was the leading trading partner of 11 countries in the Middle East, and the number seems to grow almost weekly. So countries in the region are increasingly economically dependent on China for oil exports, for Chinese trade, also for Chinese infrastructure investments. So China sees the Middle East as an important part of its Belt and Road Initiative. 21 countries in the Middle East and North Africa have now signed Belt and Road Initiative agreements with China. And of course, the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea are going to be key for this Belt and Road strategy for China. China has its first overseas military base in Djibouti, beginning to become more of an arms provider in the region. And then maybe of most concern is the deepening strategic partnership with Iran and Iran and Russia as well. Dealing with these autocratic revisionist powers on their own is difficult enough. If we have to deal with Russia and China at the same time, working together with Iran, that becomes very challenging indeed. And China signed this 25-year strategic partnership agreement with Iran. Iran, China, and Russia are conducting military exercises together. And so this new axis is concerning. And then also, I think the United States is concerned about where its traditional allies and partners are on this question, because many of our traditional partners in the Gulf are strengthening their relationships with China, strengthening their economic relationships with China. And that makes sense. The relationship with China does bring economic benefits, but I think the United States is somewhat concerned about where this may be going. It also makes sense because this Biden doctrine of democracy versus autocracy works well in Europe and Asia, where most of the United States security partners are democracies. Doesn't work as well in the Middle East, where many of our partners are non-democracies. And I think what we're seeing is that many of our partners in the region don't want to choose between the United States and China. They want to have good relations with both. And that's not unique to the Middle East. We see similar things in Southeast Asia, where countries like Singapore don't want to choose between the United States and China, want to have good relations with both. So what is my, coming to the fourth and final part of the talk, then what are my predictions for US-China policy in the Middle East for the rest of the year? Well, I do think as I said before, overall, that the US-China rivalry will intensify and that countries in the region are going to feel pulled between Beijing and Washington, and it will be increasingly difficult to have good relations with both. So let me say a little bit more about this. And I'll have a few more specific predictions. So first specific prediction, I do think that the administration is dealing with a number of other crises at the moment, and it seems like these are going to continue for the foreseeable future. Getting over COVID, domestic issues like the economy, Russia and Ukraine. I don't think that's going away anytime soon. The Iran nuclear deal, defense commitments in Asia. So I think countering China's influence in the Middle East is not going to be a top priority. But I do think that it's something that the United States is going to pay attention to and more attention to as part of this global China strategy. So I expect that the United States will highlight this issue more in its bilateral relations with regional partners. I think it might highlight the Iran-China axis and ask traditional security partners in the region, does it really make sense to have such close ties with China, a country that also has close ties with Iran, which is a rival to many of our, and a security threat to many of our partners in the Gulf. The old saying is the enemy of my enemy or the friend, what is the old saying? Well, you know, the friend of my enemy is my enemy, essentially. So can you have good relations with China even as Iran is a rival if Chinese-Iranian relations continue to improve, including in the military domain? Second, I think the United States will highlight the downsides of economic dependence on China. And we haven't seen that as much in the Middle East yet, but we have seen that globally, and it could come to the Middle East. So South Korea and Australia, Lithuania, all three examples of countries where China used its economic power to coerce these countries when they pursued policies that China didn't like. And so that is something that China could do to Gulf states as well, threaten to cut off oil exports or other things as a way, halt investments to pressure regional countries to do Beijing's bidding. We've seen debt trap diplomacy, most notably in Sri Lanka, where China began building a port for Sri Lanka and then seized the port and took control of it. So that's something else, that one of the dangers of infrastructure investments from China. And then relying on China for technology presents potential security risks. And so the United States has had this global campaign to try to discourage countries from adopting Huawei 5G technology, for example, with the argument that if you have Chinese 5G or other technology like this, it does pose a number of security risks. One, there's the intelligence risk, as all that information flowing over Chinese networks goes straight back to the Chinese government. And given China's so-called civil military fusion policy, anything that is can be accessed by a Chinese company can be accessed by the Chinese intelligence services and the Chinese government. There's also a security risk with this technology because China could, for coercion, threaten to shut off this technology or disrupt networks that rely on this technology. And then also one of the things the United States has said to its NATO partners is that if you have Chinese 5G technology, that it makes military interoperability very difficult. Can the United States military really rely on a country whose information technology infrastructure for the 21st century is run by China? In the event of a serious crisis or a serious war, there'd be real vulnerabilities there. And so it could complicate military cooperation with the United States. I think for all these reasons, the United States is going to try to encourage its allies to think about a selective decoupling with China. So to this question of do allies need to choose or not between Washington and Beijing, I think the answer is overall no. But I do think that Washington would like to try to get allies and partners on the same page when it comes to kind of deciding what are the areas for economic exchange with China where there are risks and vulnerabilities, where we do want to decouple and have fewer types of those economic relationships, and where are the areas where it's okay to engage in economic exchange with China. And it's the same for the United States. The United States is not choosing for a hard decoupling. We're continuing to sell agriculture to China, continuing to sell U.S. Treasury bonds to China. But in sensitive national security areas, we are seeing a harder decoupling. And I think the United States is going to encourage its partners to think about that as well. In sensitive national security areas, probably doesn't make sense to engage in business with China. It probably also doesn't make sense to become too dependent on China, as South Korea and Australia can explain. So you would want China to be one economic partner, but becoming too dependent on China economically could be a vulnerability. Also, when it comes to infrastructure, I think the United States is going to try to compete more. Biden's Build Back Better plan had kind of a U.S. and allied plan for promoting infrastructure development in the rest of the world to compete with China. And then in a way, and this is my final prediction, I think the Middle East could actually benefit economically from some of these global efforts to decouple from China. So one term you're hearing now in Washington is ally shoring. But basically, we can't have supply chains running through China in sensitive areas. And so we need to move those supply chains out of China to countries where we do have better relationships, to ally shoring. And so as that happens, I think that the Middle East could benefit. Just one concrete example, as Europe and Germany is seeing the risk of being too dependent on energy supplies from Russia right now. I think the United States is already encouraging them to diversify and look to the Middle East to offset possible disruptions. And so as long as the Gulf states maintain their good relationship with the United States, other partners in the Middle East, I think they could be benefit from some of that ally shoring. So I think I've spent my 20 minutes. I'll stop there, but very much look forward to the Q&A and discussion.
All right, thank you so much. It was a good overview of that sort of tricky task the U.S. has of kind of deftly navigating its relationship with friends and foes as it comes to China. And finally, we're going to go from China to Russia. And for that, we will have Dr. Anna Borshchevskaya with us. She is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute's Diane and Guilford Glaser Foundation program on great power competition. And she focuses her research on Russia's policy in the Middle East. And accordingly, today she will discuss how the U.S. is handling Russia's actions in the region. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I look forward to a good discussion. As the last speaker, I'm going to try to be as brief as possible so that we can really hone in on more of the questions that are of interest to you. I was asked to talk about U.S.'s handling of Russia's actions in the region. In order to answer this question, in order to make that assessment, I first want to begin with a broad overview of what are Russia's actions in the region, and put that sort of in a broader, a little bit of a historic and strategic perspective, in broad strokes, to set the context. The first is that for most of Russia's history as an independent state, Russia had interests in the Middle East. It is really only in the 1990s that Russia briefly and partially retreated from this region. And the reason why I bring up this point is because it is oftentimes American, Western policymakers, this is something that they tend to forget. That Russia in the Middle East did not begin even with the Soviet Union, it began centuries earlier. And so it is Russia's interests are also in the region are also going to outlive Vladimir Putin as well. There certainly are specific elements of Russia's approach to the Middle East that are unique to Putin, and some that are tactical, some that are strategic. But others have a very long-lasting resonance to Russian policymakers. Again, I think this is something that this is a point that over the last maybe decade or so has been a little bit underappreciated in American foreign policy discourse. My second point on here is that we analytically in the West tend to, when we look at Russia, we tend to separate geographically Russia and Europe, whether it's Central, Eastern, Western Europe, or the Middle East. But for Russia, and if you think about, a map, it would actually make a lot of sense. Russia tends to look at these issues much more holistically from a security, from a threat perception standpoint. And so the fact of the matter is the region that we would call the Middle East, together with the Caucasus, South and North Caucasus, and Central Asia, maybe a little bit of Afghanistan, kind of as this one big whole, constitutes what the Russian state historically viewed as its vulnerable soft underbelly. And the state cared about this region precisely because it felt vulnerable there, at least as much as it cared about Europe, if not more. And so when we look at Russia's, now zooming into more recent Russia's actions in the Middle East, there are kind of a number of issues that come together all at once. Again, issues that are both more immediate and more historic. But the kind of the hallmark of Vladimir Putin's approach to the region and the actions that he takes is one where he has absorbed a lot of lessons of the Soviet Union's failures in this region. The Soviet Union approached the Middle East through an ideological communist lens, and it cultivated client states, patrons, as well, and it also had clear adversaries. The Soviet Union also had invested a lot of resources, oftentimes really gave it away. The resource investment was massive. And ultimately, the Soviet Union fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Russia had to briefly retreat from the region. Putin, now there's also the issue of Soviet experience in Afghanistan, which is relevant, and I go into that more in my recent book, but so I won't go into this too much into this discussion, but it is relevant because the experience of Afghanistan especially, but also experiences in the Middle East and so forth, those were experiences of overextension. And Putin's Russia approaches all of its foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, through a limited actions approach. In fact, Russia's General Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov specifically outlined a strategy of limited actions. And it is also coming from a perspective of a state that understands it has limitations. And so therefore, it's going to use its resources much more strategically and selectively, rather than invest a lot of money, a lot of blood, invest a lot of soldiers and so forth, and risk bankruptcy and seeing little in return. So that's the first kind of overall framework through which to look at what Russia is doing. The other key, and again, this is unique to Vladimir Putin, although it began before him, it's not really his idea, is that unlike the Soviet Union that cultivated friends, but also foes, Putin's Russia approaches this region through very pragmatic, hard kind of reality in the Middle East, both governments and major opposition movements to them. It is a fundamentally flexible policy. And therefore, it has a lot more resilience, and over the years has exhibited a lot more resilience than a lot of American analysts had given it credit for. Now, specifically in terms of actions, I think it's clear that it was ultimately the Russian Syria intervention in 2015 that officially returned Russia to the map of the Middle East. But Putin had cultivated a lot of other smaller steps that had ultimately brought Russia to this point. So Russia was already present throughout the region through things like trade, diplomacy, again, kind of very targeted, limited points of access. But the intervention is what ultimately brought Russia back on the map. And the region, of course, saw it. And I think key is that the region saw that contrary to being stuck in a quagmire that President Obama had predicted, contrary to an overextension that so many had expected, the way Russia conducted itself in Syria was precisely through limited means and through getting other actors to do lots of heavy lifting, And in point of fact, one of the key objectives of saving Assad to date has been met. Assad, in fact, is looking at normalization, including among Arab states. But of course, what you're also seeing critically is that Russia is increasingly looking at warm water ports access throughout the region, not building ports, because building ports is expensive and Russia doesn't have those resources, but securing access agreements. And that is incredibly important because Russia has more capabilities to project power into NATO's southern flank, into Europe, but also deeper into the region and into Africa. And you're also seeing connections between the Syrian theater and other theaters, especially in Libya, connections with Turkey. Syria really, Russia's military position in Syria provides it a springboard through which it can project power into multiple directions. And in the interest of saving time, I think I'll stop there. I have more to say, but I don't want to go over. I want to go from here, zero in on the U.S.'s handling of Russia's actions. I don't want to repeat what Matt said earlier. I agree with it in that the administration wanted to put sort of Russia in a box earlier. It wanted to have a stable, predictable relationship with Russia, as Matt mentioned earlier, in order to focus on China. And the past year has shown that that's really not possible, especially given what's happening in Ukraine right now. And what's happening in Ukraine will affect Turkey. It's going to affect both the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And that's why we're seeing Russia's increasing its naval presence in both of these bodies of water just literally in recent days. And so this idea that you can put Russia in a box and focus on China did not work. The question is, does the administration, how is the administration handling this, specifically when it comes to Russia in the Middle East? And here there are still a lot of questions. First, I think and foremost on Syria, the fact of the matter is we still don't fully understand President Biden's Syria policy. We can talk about the Trump administration's approach. We can agree or disagree, but at least we understood what the policy was. We had a special envoy, and there was a policy of putting economic pressure on Assad. And certainly that mattered with regard to Russia. It was clear that the Russian government very much disliked sanctions against the Assad regime. They were very vocal about it. And they remain this way to this day. But the fact of the matter is we're seeing, at least in terms of steps that are practically taking place without an explicit policy articulation, is a much more lax approach in a sense of kind of tacit endorsement of what's happening in terms of Assad's normalization, in terms of sanctions. And this is especially visible through the current discussion of energy deal of bringing energy into Lebanon through Syria through the Assad regime, which it's a very complicated scheme that I'm sure this audience is aware of. It involves a lot of countries, but ultimately, when it comes to Russia and Assad, and is that it is poised to be more helpful than not. Ultimately, an absence of an answer is also kind of an answer in and of itself, right? But certainly, this is something that, if I were to make recommendations, is to watch more closely in the coming months ahead for the year. My other point, I think, we'll touch a little bit on Iran and how and where Russia fits into this issue. The administration continues to see Russia's goals broadly aligned with ultimately reaching a deal on Iran. This is not a new viewpoint. Previous administrations during the discussion of the Iran deal also tended to view Russia as helpful. There's a little bit of a mismatch here again in terms of perceptions versus what actually happens, because Russia ultimately, while seemed to have been interested in the Iran deal in 2015, had also acted as Iran's lawyer. And if I go back to my earlier point, about Putin's overall approach to the region. I had mentioned that he has built this framework of good contacts with everybody. But if you look a little bit deeper, the fact of the matter is the closer relationships are with anti-American actors. And that is chiefly, basically, the kind of the Iran, Assad, Hezbollah triangle. I don't think that's going to change. I think I think Russia and Iran, in many respects, come as one strategic set, at least when it comes to Syria. This does not mean that there are no disagreements between the two, but on broader strategic issues, not only do they agree, but Russia really needs Iran in Syria because it relied on Iran to do a lot of the heavy lifting, a lot of the more difficult, more costly work, which allowed Russia to carry out an inexpensive, relatively inexpensive operation. And so, you know, there are a lot of questions in terms of where the Iran deal is headed, but as far as, I guess, my assessment of the administration's of handling of Russia specifically on this deal, there might be a little bit of wishful thinking. But the fact of the matter is Russia is interested in being perceived as a key global power, a great power without which major international decisions cannot be made. And insofar as participating in the diplomatic discussions on this issue, that is certainly advantageous to Russia. But I guess I just want to bring back the point that historically Russia always diluted sanctions against Iran and downplayed the concerns about the Iranian nuclear program. Ultimately, frankly, I think, you know, judging on some of the comments that Russians have made over the years, I think many of them simply are much more comfortable, would be much more comfortable with a nuclear Iran. This is not to say that they would certainly prefer, put it this way, a non-nuclear Iran, but they don't have the same kind of alarmist attitude about it as we do in the West. And I think it's unclear if the administration is necessarily fully seen this distinction. Lastly, and I want to conclude there again in the interest of saving time, although Ukraine is not, of course, part of the Middle East, it is important in how we assess Biden administration's handling of Russia in the Middle East, because it is clear that at this stage, the administration is taking the buildup around Ukraine very seriously. And I'm happy to go into more details on this issue if anybody is interested. But the reason why it matters to our discussion here in the Middle East is because not only about more specifically about Turkey and the Black Sea and how that connects to the Mediterranean, but also because this crisis is the biggest post-Cold War crisis. We have not really seen a crisis like this for 30 years. And that is because what Putin is trying to do is fundamentally restructure European security architecture. He's looking to expel the United States from Europe. Whether or not he will succeed is a totally different matter, but the fact of the matter is that is what he's looking for. He also, now he is looking to destabilize Ukraine, of course, make no mistake, but ultimately what's happening is much bigger. This is not just about Ukraine, just like the Syria intervention was not really about Syria. Both of these both activities here were about erosion of the US-led global order. It was about taking the United States down a size because the Russian state has come to perceive American primacy in global affairs as disadvantageous to Russia. And because no matter what's going to happen in the upcoming weeks about Ukraine, whether or not Putin will invade or not, this crisis will be with us for the next year. Because we can have another buildup, because Putin is thinking about his legacy, for a whole host of reasons, his commitment to destabilizing Ukraine, but also using it as a lever to push on these bigger issues is not going to go away. What that does mean also is that it's possible that the West and the United States specifically may simply not pay enough attention to what Russia is doing in the Middle East, with so much attention focused on Ukraine. And that's also just something to keep in mind as we look at the year ahead. And looking at the clock, I will stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.